Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents and U.S. history. Today, I'm continuing with my discussion on uh, the Watergate scandal. Today, I want to focus on the Washington Post. It was the Washington Post that employed um, the journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. These men I've discussed, right? I've discussed, and there have been movies about them. All the President's Men, which was done in 1976, which starred Dustin Hoffman as um, Carl Bernstein and uh, Robert Redford as Bob Woodward. Focuses on those two men, and history focuses on their doggedness, their resilience, tenacity in uncovering and investigating the connection of the White House to the failed burglary attempt at the Watergate. And it would have, of course, they would eventually expose a kaleidoscope of lies and a far reaching um, campaign of espionage, sabotage, and surveillance funded by uh, President Richard Nixon and his campaign. Uh, that's CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President, against Democrats, and against the enemies of President Richard Nixon. So today I want to focus on something that's really important that I don't think there's enough coverage of, unless you know the history and you study the history. The fact that those two men were actually, they had an employer who paid their checks, who were, who served as a platform for them to publish their investigations. Uh, Despite the backlash, right? There was a lot of there was a harassment campaign with even threats to the lives of the publishers, the owners. So today I want to focus on the owners of on the Washington Post and the owners of the Washington Post. I'm going to start off by just reading an excerpt from the personal history by you know which is an autobiography of the publisher of the Washington Post at the time. I'm just going to quickly read it. The owner was Catherine Graham, right? Catherine Graham, and I'm going to discuss the family in just a bit, but I'm just going to quickly read an excerpt from her personal history, which is quite interesting. Just bear with me. So it is. This is a passage. My eyes. I need better glasses. My eyes are actually becoming quite weak, despite me wearing these. In an effort to check it out, Bernstein called Mitchell directly, reaching him at a hotel in New York, where Mitchell answered the phone himself. When Carl told him about the story, Mitchell exploded with an exclamation of Jesus, so violent that Carl felt it was some sort of primal scream and thought Mitchell might die on the telephone. After he'd read him the first two paragraphs, Mitchell interrupted, still screaming, "All that crap. You're putting it in the paper? It's all been denied. Katie Graham's gonna get her tit caught in a big fat ringer if that's published. Good Christ. That's the most sickening thing I ever heard." Right? And that was one of the threats from that was actually from John Mitchell. John Mitchell, of course, is the only U.S. Attorney General who got convicted for acts he committed, of crimes he committed during his tenure. He managed the slush fund. Now, let me look for something else. Of course, they received a number of threats. Of course, the White House continued to lie, right? This is coming from the White House. Uh, This continues. That day, Ziegler began his morning briefing at the White House, charging that stories, quote, stories are being run that are based on hearsay, innuendo, guilt by association. It goes without saying that this administration does not condone sabotage or espionage or surveillance of individuals, right? And so that same afternoon, Clark McGregor, Nixon's campaign chairman, said that the Post, that's the Washington Post, the Post credibility, in quotes, the Post credibility has today sunk lower than that of George McGovern, the Democrat running against Nixon. Um, so you can see as the Washington Post journalists were publishing, trying to establish a link between Nixon and the Watergate failed burglary, right? They continued, the White House continued to gaslight and say, oh, that, you know, White House continued to, Nixon and his aides continued to dissociate themselves and gaslight, and they were smearing, casting aspersions on the Washington Post, saying, accusing them of shabby journalism, right, and character assassination, and saying these people are crazy. They're just gaslighting them. Now, is also a this is from a memo. So Nixon sent a memo to one of his aides, Haldeman, and this is a quote, right, of Nixon's a memo Nixon wrote to Ron Ziegler. Ron Ziegler was the 29-year-old um, press secretary of Richard Nixon. He served as press secretary throughout, so you could just see how they were they blackballed. That's Richard Nixon and his administration blackballed the Washington Post, right, for continuing its investigations and trying to establish a connection between the Watergate burglary and the White House, right? In the aftermath of everything, today we know uh, how the White House was involved. By the time when the events were unfolding, the public didn't know. It took the doggedness of the journalist, Bernstein and Woodward. I keep saying Woodward. Woodward in publishing their stories, and their employer, the Washington Post, carrying on, right, despite all the attacks. And I'm going to discuss the attacks, the harassment that Washington Post suffered. But this is a memo from Richard Nixon himself, in quote, Ziegler, under no circumstances, is to see anybody from the Washington Post, and no one on the White House staff is to see anybody from the Washington Post or return any calls to them. Just treat the Post absolutely coldly. All of their people are to be treated in this manner. That's from the president, Richard Nixon, right? So they suffered a lot. So that's except from those are excerpts from Catherine Graham, whom the Attorney General was referring to as Katie, right? Katie Graham. In fact, in her autobiography, she said nobody ever called her Katie, right? So it was part of the misogyny of the Attorney General, right? John Mitchell. And I've done a video discussing, John Mitchell. So he was making threats, right? That if he was stunned, I just read from the excerpt, and he basically was threatening her using all sorts of vulgarity, saying if Washington Post publishes, um, the link, claiming that John Mitchell was managing the slush fund, because John Mitchell was, he'd been the Attorney General and he was now the chairman of the committee to re-elect the president, that was using all sorts of that had hired ex-CIA operatives and ex-FBI to be conducting espionage, sabotage, and surveillance on Democrats in order to undermine the Democratic candidates, right? So that Nixon could win the election. And so he was threatening them, and he was threatening saying Katie Graham that she's gonna get her tits. Excuse the vulgarity, but That's what I just read it. She's going to get her tit, of course, that means her breast or whatever, right? Her tits caught up in a big fat ringer, right? If she publishes it, right? So you see the threats to the publisher, right? So he was threatening her life, and it wasn't just that was not the first threat, right? The first direct threat. Um, he was telling Carl Bernstein, right, who was one of the journalists, and that was from the Attorney General, right, threatening her. Um, that's John Mitchell, but Catherine Graham would establish that she would actually um, state that other people that there was a contact of hers, a good friend of hers. His name was Andre Meyer, who was a Wall Street insider, and he had contacts in the administration. And he said he'd been talking to the people in the administration, and they were actually making threats. So he was warning her that Catherine Graham, the publisher, the owner of the Washington Post at the time, that she shouldn't be alone, right? She should make sure she's not alone, that she should always have somebody with her, and just those threats to their lives. I've done an earlier video discussing how the plumbers, right, had uh, an enemies a list of enemies on Nixon's enemies list, and there was a guy called Jack Anderson that they had planned. That's Howard Hunt, and it was alleged that Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy they'd planned how to use LSD to smear the steering wheel of smear the steering wheel of Jack Anderson, who was a journalist, right, and that Nixon hated, and to make him get high, right? And so he would start to hallucinate and to be suicidal, and he would crash his car and die, or that he should be killed by a staged mugging, right? So this was what the plumbers and the committee to re-elect the president. This is part of what they were doing, and so here was this guy, this friend of the publisher of Washington Post. Uh, that's Andre Meyer, a friend of Katie Graham, was the publisher of Washington Post. He was advising her not to be alone and to be careful, So that was that. But apart from those threats, personal threats, acts of intimidation, threatening their personal safety, the personal safety of the publisher, there were also other threats. They actually engaged in direct economic attacks, right? The Washington Post, from their share value of $38, right? $38 per share, their share value dropped once they started publishing these. Once they started publishing the stories, right? Trying to link a connection, make a connection, establish a connection between the White House and the failed burglary at the Watergate, that it was actually linked to the president directly. Their share value uh, dropped from $38 per share to as low as $16 in just a few weeks, and then over time to initially it was in the 20s, and eventually to $16. So that's 58% drop in the share value. Now, if the company is not making money, right? If they're not making money, they're suffering economic attacks to get them to stop publishing uh, certain stories. The owner of the company is in business to make money, to make profits and return profits to the shareholders. So if that's happening, it can put them out of business. But Catherine Graham must be commended for she was resilient. She didn't allow herself to be intimidated. People have said that it appeared that she personally hated Richard Nixon, right? That she personally hated Richard Nixon, and that's why she didn't stop her journalists from continuing with investigating and writing about the Watergate scandal to link Nixon to the crisis, because that was eventually it took over 2 years, right? The Watergate break-in uh, occurred June 17, June 17, 1972. Um, it wasn't until August 8th, 1974, that Richard Nixon finally announced that he was going to resign the next day, and he left office. He resigned in disgrace on August 9, 1972, because of this Watergate scandal that the Washington Post pressed on doggedly, and it got the interest of the public. So their share value dropped, but in other ways, directly, um, the so they owned other uh, they owned TV stations as well. The Washington Post owned TV stations in Florida as well. Now, out of 30 stations, right, only two, only two TV stations owned by Washington Post, right, were threatened with license revocations in the state of Florida, right, in the state of Florida. So it wasn't easy. While it's not easy to establish a direct paper trail that what was going on in Florida, right, was actually connected and ordered and orchestrated by Richard Nixon and his White House. Well, a strange coincidence, right? It's not far fetched, because the period, the time period that the these license revocation threats in Florida to the Washington Post TV stations, right? The only uh, outfit that owned TV stations, right, to be threatened with license revocations. It coincided with the period they were being dogged. The period between December 1972 and January 2nd, 1973. That was when the threats to their license renewals, occurred. So that was a sort of economic pressure that they were facing. Now, in the 2.5 year period, um, the Washington Post had to pay over $1 million in legal fees, battling to retain their licenses, battling for the renewal of their licenses in Florida, which was being challenged, right, by apparently the state of Florida. But we're seeing ways that the White House and the federal government indirectly coerces states governments, because the state governments are run by officials. Now, in this case, the Catherine Graham, in her autobiography, she indicates that, well, the actors in Florida were linked. They had close ties to Richard Nixon, Richard Nixon's aides in the White House. They were close allies, and so she said even though they didn't have a direct paper trail that it was Nixon who was ordering that Florida put pressure on these TV stations owned by Washington Post uh, to revoke their licenses there as sort of pressure to economic pressure to get them to back off. She made those conclusions, and it doesn't sound far fetched. So there were those threats to their licenses. There were the just meant threats to personal safety and so many other things. But the Washington Post, Katie Graham, there, her name is Catherine Graham. It was John Mitchell uh, in an instance of misogyny that he called her Katie, right? Katie Graham, because she said she's always gone by Catherine Graham. So I call her Catherine Graham. She withstood the pressure. She didn't buckle down, and she didn't get in the way. She didn't interfere with Bernstein and Bob Woodward's reporting of the Watergate scandal. And this went on for over 2.5 years, and it paid off. In May, when things during after things started to unravel, and there was more disclosure through the trial in January 1973, when the Howard Hunt, Gordon Liddy, they pled guilty to conspiracy and some other charges. Initially, they were silent because they were paid to keep quiet, so they said there was no link to higher ups, right? But later on, one of the the Watergate 7, that's what they were called. James McCord, who was a former CIA officer, right? He would write a letter to the judge, John Sirica, and he would confess. He said he committed perjury because he'd been pressured to dissociate higher ups in the White House from the Watergate burglary, and then he confessed. He said he committed perjury, that they had been paid to keep quiet, to be silent, to plead guilty, and to state that that the White House was not involved, because he said there were threats made to his family, to the lives of their family, of his family, that if they revealed the involvement of the White House with Watergate's break-in, that their fam their the safety of their family would be jeopardized. And so, uh, with that revelation, the Watergate scandal started to come out, in the public, and then Senate eventually set up a committee using and got the president to hire Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, who now started to investigate the scandal, which ultimately led to the revelation of the secret tapes that Nixon kept. Nixon was a paranoid figure, right? Historians and psychologists today, they say he might have been a psychopath. It's not clear if he was clearly so, but they said he was a narcissist. They said he was deeply paranoid, insecure. He was very vengeful. It's very unclear. Um, so eventually, the Washington Post in 1973 would receive the Pulitzer Prize for meritorious service in journalism. So Nixon's White House had tried to alienate them, right? They tried to isolate them, they ostracized them. In fact, he banned them from the White House, right? While they were trying to report, this was in 1972. They banned them from the White House. 72, 73, they were banned, and but they continued reporting, and they put economic pressure on them, but they continued, and there's kudos to the publisher, Catherine Graham, and of course the editor as well at the time, Ben Bradley, and a guy Simmons. So I'm going to do another video. I want to keep this short because I think it's important to establish the Washington Post ownership at that time also had a sort of interesting background. The history is interesting, and it touches on other events that I've discussed previously. So the Washington Post was owned by at the time by Catherine Graham and her kids. Her maiden name is Meyer, right? So the her father, Eugene Meyer, had been a World Bank, the first World Bank president. He'd been a chairman of the Federal Reserve. So he was a multimillionaire financier, and he bought the Washington Post in 1933 through a bankruptcy, sale. So, and his son-in-law, that's her husband, Philip Graham, who was a Harvard-educated lawyer and a friend of JFK, would start to manage the company. And so her father would make 30% of the Washington Post a gift to her, and would, uh, you know, help finance the purchase of 70% by her husband, Philip Graham. So it's interesting what happened. So I'm going to do another video. Stop this, and I'll discuss the ownership and how it changed. Today, of course, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who was once richest man in the world. He bought the Washington Post in 2013 from the Meyer Graham family. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.